Good morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. For those of you who would like to ask Fiona Hill and Bob Abernethy questions, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen where you can type in your questions. It's now my great pleasure to introduce today's program, a conversation with Fiona Hill on Russia, Vladimir Putin, and Ukraine. Fiona Hill is Senior Fellow of Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution at the Center on the U.S. and Europe. Robert Abernethy, as you all know, is a longtime board member of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. He's also founder and president of the Tech Center and serves on many boards, including Brookings and the Atlantic Council. So with that, Bob, I appreciate so much you coming on screen and introducing and discussing Fiona Hill's focus today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kim. I'm delighted to be here with all my fellow council members. It's a pleasure being with you this morning. This is part of a 6-part series where we're discussing national security and how that impacts our international relations and our relating to other countries. The first interview that we had was with David Petraeus. That was followed by Fred Kemp, who is president of the Atlantic Council. Today with Fiona Hill. The next one after Fiona's is Anne Marie Slaughter. You remember she used to be dean of the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. She's now president of New America. Following her will be Michelle Flournoy, a lady who many people had expected to be appointed Secretary of Defense, but President Biden chose another person. The last in our series is Jason Matheny, the new president of RAND Corporation, which is, just a few blocks away from Kim's office, the office of our Los Angeles World Affairs Council Town Hall. I want to welcome Fiona back again to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. She is an expert on Russian and European affairs. I don't think there is any other living person in the United States that knows more about Putin and Russia than she does. She has been a student of these subjects for most of her lifetime. She did spend a few years getting a PhD in history at Harvard, but she served George W. Bush and President Obama as deputy assistant to the president and senior director for European and Russian affairs, all on the National Security Council. She authored a book, Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin. She also has served the Trump administration and on its National Intelligence Council. She, I think, timed her exit quite appropriately. She got out 10 days before that famous telephone call between Trump and Zelensky that received so much attention. So I don't know how you managed to know that timing, Fiona, but it was great timing. Currently, you are at Brookings. What is Brookings, and what do you do at Brookings?
Well, just one quick corrective, just quickly there, Bob, because obviously these titles sometimes sound the same. I was actually the National Intelligence Officer under Bush and Obama, and then I was on the National Security Council under Trump. And I didn't quite escape entirely from everything that followed from that phone call, as people remember, of course, because I ended up getting snarled up in that first impeachment trial. And you, of course, are on the board of Brookings Institution, so you clearly know what Brookings is. But Brookings, of course, was set up more than 100 years ago, same sort of time frame as the Council on Foreign Relations and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Out of that early 20th century philanthropy, where many people were stepping forward to try to encourage more scholarship on issues that were relevant to United States domestic and foreign policy, especially in economic studies or in the realm of national security. And particularly when this is around the time of World War I and the run-up to World War I, where there was a lot of concern about what was happening in the broader world and what kind of impact that might have on the United States. Brookings actually is an institution with a .edu at the end of it, so very much focused on research and scholarly production. But Brookings also does loan out people like myself to government at various points. My first appointment at the National Intelligence Council, I was loaned out on an agreement with the United States government. There have been many others who have done this, including Martin Indyk, who many people here might remember and know from his time at Brookings, now at the Council on Foreign Relations, who was the special envoy for peace in the Middle East with Israel and Palestine some years ago as well. The most recent stint in government, obviously being somewhat controversial at the time, coming in the wake of the Russian interference in the US election campaign in 2016, I took a leave and then came back to Brookings again. We're basically independent institution. We are non-partisan, although people like to try to push Brookings in a certain direction. We have a number of programs looking at foreign policy, which also covers national security and larger strategic issues, economic studies, which looks at the US economy in particular, a number of centers there. And Bob, you've been associated with many of those activities for some time. Global economic development, metropolitan studies, which is looking at the whole future of urban development, and rather large set of issues looking at demography and changes in the United States, patterns of mobility, migration, etc. And we have scholars from all over the world who work at Brookings, again, with the emphasis on non-partisan, policy-related and policy-relevant scholarship that can help the US in particular, but also other governments and other stakeholders in thinking about some of the crucial issues facing us today. We've got a lot of work on energy and climate change and other activities as well. So that's Brookings, perhaps not quite in a nutshell, but something approximating that. And it's the institution, not institute. A lot of people always call it the Brookings Institute. We even have mugs now saying Brookings Institute crossed out institution to remind ourselves as well of that often frequent mistake that people make.
Thank you. Speaking of books, you've written another one. I have been sort of perplexed about what's been happening in American politics for this last decade. And originally, I concentrated trying to understand it on one actor upon our American stage, our immediate past president, President Trump, and explaining things in terms of him. But I came to realize that really what was happening over the last decade was a result of a much larger and broader picture. And I think you've helped me understand that picture by what you've recently written. You wrote this book. Here, I'm going to put it up to see. It's a great read. There is nothing for you here, finding opportunity in the 21st century. It's a bit of a memoir. It's also part history, but it's also your policy prescriptions for the future for our country. I bought my copy from Amazon. It's easy to obtain, and I really recommend it. It's a great read for all you guys that are council members that are here with us today. You mentioned Brookings was 100 years old. Also, 100 years ago was when, I guess, the fragments of the old Russian Empire started to come together as the new Soviet Union. Talk to us about that period of time. What happened to form the Soviet Union? And was it a tumultuous period of time or not?
Well, it was certainly a tumultuous period of time. And to be honest, I mean, much of our politics looks like we're repeating that same period in history. Because if we think back, to that 100-year time frame that also coincides with the establishment of the Brookings Institution, it was really much scarred by World War I. Which, of course, if we look at the context of the topic we're talking about today, which is Russia, Putin, and Ukraine, the the idea of World War One, of course, when it sparked off in August of 1914, was it would all be over by Christmas. And of course it wasn't, and the war dragged on for another 4 years after that. And of course we're contemplating now, when we look at Ukraine, a war that could well drag on for many years to come. And I know we're going to get back to that. But this is also relevant to the discussion and to the time frame that you've picked here, because immediately after World War One, we of course get the Great Influenza, another global pandemic that compounds the dislocation and devastation of the war with further deaths, particularly of younger people. And in fact, it was many soldiers returning from the war that spread the disease around, which initially started off as a bird flu in chicken stocks in Kansas farms. Who anybody knows who's read the multiple books on the Great Influenza. And against the backdrop of all of that, of course, as a result of World War One, we had the crumbling of empires. There was the British Empire was crumbling as well. It doesn't really get the death knell until we get around to World War II. But we had the Austro-Hungarian Empire fall apart as a result of World War One. Of course, the shot that was heard around the world that sparked off the war took place in Sarajevo as a result of all of those pressures inside the Austro-Hungarian Empire, when Franz Josef, the prince, Austrian prince, crown prince, was assassinated alongside his wife there by a disaffected representative of the southern Slavic groups who wanted to have their emancipation from their Austrian overlords. And the German Empire falls apart as well. The Kaiser, the end of the Kaiser. We've just seen recently the bizarre episode in Germany of Prince Heinrich XIII of the Reuss family of Thuringia trying to actually restore the Reich and wanting to go back to the 1920s and turn back the clock on the destruction of the German Empire. And we also saw, of course, which you're alluding to, Bob, the dissolution of the Russian Empire, the Russian Revolution of 1917, the emergence of Lenin and the Bolsheviks. And against that backdrop, Lenin and his Bolshevik compatriots trying to forge a new state out of the ruins of the Russian Empire. And it's in the course of creating that new state, the Soviet Union, that they create an entity, the Republic, the Socialist Republic of Ukraine. And Vladimir Putin is actually telling us today that he's trying to go back in time to that period, 1922, 100 years ago this year, was the creation of the Soviet Union and the first Soviet constitution, in which a quasi-independent Ukraine was enshrined. Vladimir Putin says he wants to go back to that time to erase Ukraine off the map, and that Ukraine should never have existed, and he blames Lenin and the Bolsheviks for even creating the idea of Ukraine out of some of the lands that he says, of course they are Slavic, but are Russian-speaking and belong to Russia itself and a part of the Russian world. So in many respects, we're kind of fighting on many fronts still the after effects of World War One and the great pandemic 100 years ago. And there are some really eerie echoes and parallels of that period in our contemporary time.
100 years ago, that was 15 years before the Los Angeles World Affairs / Town Hall was first started.
Is that right?
Yes. And it was also about 18 years before I first started opening my eyes and observing things around the world like this. But I've had the experience of having observed maybe 4/5 of the century that you're talking about there. We're 100 years later. Would you compare where we are today as a world with where we were then 100 years ago? And are we in a tumultuous time also? Is there a parallelism between then and now?
There are a lot, actually, and we've got a lot of similar risks. We're really seeing the world change dramatically. Old norms going out the window. Again, these long lingering effects of the pandemic. We're still in the middle of it. Economic dislocations. I mean, we're about to go through, and we are in the midst of a whole new economic transition again. Same thing that, we saw after World War II as well. So this is one of those pivots in history that, people at Brookings and historians and others like to, write about a lot. And of course, as a historian, talking about 100 years ago is like catnip, of course. We can see a lot of the same kind of worrying trends. But look, the main point is we've learned a lot in the last 100 years. We know how things turned out after World War I, when we started to try to create new institutional arrangements, the League of Nations, for example, and the United States stepping back from that. We know of kind of the way that our politics unfolded under Woodrow Wilson and some of the upheavals that we had, again, very similar to our own trials and tribulations on the domestic front here. And of course, if we fast forward in that time to a period when Bob, you might have had a little bit more memory of, the aftermath of World War II, and perhaps some of the others who are joining us on the Zoom today, we realized then that destruction of war had huge ramifications for global politics and our economic prosperity, and that we needed to take drastic action to recover from that. And of course, we embarked at that period, so that's 70 odd years ago, on a whole remaking of global institutions, the creation of the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF. So many of the institutions that we kind of take for granted today came out of that recognition of a massive destruction that we would have to turn around. We also thought about how we were going to rebuild Europe. And of course, there was the Marshall Plan, which the Brookings Institution took part in back in the day. And there was a lot of rethinking about how we knit the European continent back together again, and how we forge new transatlantic relationships. And we're going to have to do that after this war in Ukraine. There's been so much dislocation. And in a way, Putin is saying that we've been fighting 100 years war. Every time he refers to Ukraine, he takes us back in time and almost gives us this sense that we've been at a state of war, at least in his mind we have been, going back to that collapse of the Russian Empire, the creation of the Soviet Union in Ukraine, all the way through all of the other conflicts. And he's trying to reorder Europe in his fashion. And we're going to have to think about what we can do to counter that.
You talked a little bit about, or actually more than a little bit, about the institutions that came out of World War II and came out of those conversations between Churchill and Roosevelt and de Gaulle. And of course, the first one, I think, was the European Coal and Steel Community Pact. How has the Ukraine war affected those global institutions today? Has it changed them, or has it changed what needs to be done in regards to them?
Well, I think what it has done is shown up all the inadequacies of the current institutions, because over time they've deteriorated. We haven't given as much thought as we did, in that initial aftermath of the war to how we keep them going. I mean, we've been calling all the time for reform of the United Nations and not really got anywhere. And this current conflict has shown the inadequacies of the United Nations, of course, with the structure of the UN Security Council and having China and Russia on there that can veto every resolution that's related to the war in Ukraine. But they've also shown the need still for these multilateral organizations, and certainly then areas in which we could put emphasis in the future, because we've seen the office of the Secretary General of Gutierrez play a role in looking at war crimes in Ukraine, seeing what's been happening on the ground. And of course, we've seen the UN Secretary General, along with President Erdogan of Turkey, step in to try to create a deal on grain to basically bust through the blockade in the Black Sea that Vladimir Putin has imposed since the outbreak of conflict on grain exports from Ukraine. Food security has really risen to a critical issue. Now, if we look back over, the last several decades, it was sort of 40 years ago since the Live Aid concerts and famine in Somalia and Ethiopia and elsewhere, which is raising its terrible head again. And at that point, even then, back in the 1980s, it was seen that the United Nations and the World Food Programme and other institutions that we'd created were really kind of inadequate to the task, and you saw a lot of private endeavour emerging there. And I think that now, 40 years on with the war in Ukraine, there's been a reinvigoration of the role that United Nations can play, again, though, being triggered off by famine and food security issues. But we've become more cognizant of these. And of course, agriculture is big business. And, it's interesting to think about the role of Ukraine over the last 30 years. Ukraine always had the reputation, going back to the Tsarist era, of being the breadbasket of Europe, certainly the breadbasket of the Russian Empire. But we now see that Ukraine was the breadbasket for all kinds of countries in Middle East, in Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and elsewhere around the globe. And this war has basically disrupted a quarter of the global grain trade, especially for those countries that are the most vulnerable and fragile. And so we've had to step in to deal with this. And I think if we look down the line, getting back to the point that you were saying about European coal and steel community, we may be actually having to think about food security and grain and agribusiness and fertilizer, which is another big aspect of this, because Russia is one of the largest producers of fertilizer, and that's been cut off from many of the markets. I think we'll be seeing a driving force now there, particularly of countries in the so-called global south in Africa and elsewhere, really pushing here to have more attention paid for this down the line. So we could see another form of international community along the lines of steel and coal emerging out of there. Now, steel and coal were obviously all tightly linked into energy security, and also the future of industry. And there was that big build-up of manufacturing industry after World War II. And Germany was at the heart of that, as you well know. And of course, now we're seeing major shifts with the war in Ukraine, the cutting off of energy, the oil cap on sort of shipping of Russian oil, cutting off of gas supplies, and a whole reorientation there. And of course, that's partly to do with sanctions by the West, the United States and Europe. But there's also a growing realization, finally, about the vulnerability of dependence on Russian gas. And of course, the United States has been harping on about this for decades, since the first long-term contracts for gas exports from the Soviet Union to Germany and other European powers. We've always said this was a massive vulnerability, and now finally it's apparent. And so we're seeing a huge rush to the doors in Europe, and a real emphasis now on a transition at a very difficult time. Obviously, we're wanting to accelerate a transition in any case because of climate change, but now national security priorities have been uppermost. And Europe is going to have to reorient itself to a whole different energy configuration. So you could also see, going back to the past, a new community on energy and a new way of looking at energy security that brings European countries more into line with each other. And that, of course, will have its knock-on effects on other kinds of production, because steel and coal were intrinsically entwined, and German manufacturing, that heavy, intensive manufacturing, including for steel and specialized steels, was very much dependent on cheap gas from Russia, and that's at an end now. So there's going to have to be a rethinking of production inside of Europe as well, more emphasis on green technologies, and maybe some major shifts in the way that Europe does business. So I mean, the bottom line of all this, not to go on too much, is that we're in, the Germans are calling it a Zeitenwende, kind of literally a sort of a bending in time, a pivotal moment, a huge change in time. The war in Ukraine has shifted everything on so many different axes, all in line with what's been happening already, with shifts as a result of the pandemic.
War is waged traditionally by limited techniques. Recently, it's been waged by many more than traditional techniques. You've begun to explore some of those things in your last set of remarks. Can you extend that a bit more on how the Ukraine war is being fought by other ways than on the battlefield?
Yeah, now the battlefield is obviously a kind of major part of this, as we're referencing, and there's these, again, eerie parallels between World War I and the current time. Everyone's seen, I think, the pictures of trench warfare in around cities like Bakhmut in Ukraine, for example. But absolutely, Bob, we're in a whole different frame of war. I mean, the Russians often talk about total war, information war. And we've obviously in the United States have been all in for some time on economic warfare, financial warfare, sanctions, embargoes, caps on shipping price for oil, for example. The Russians have done plenty of this. I referenced already the grain blockade in the Black Sea. Blockades are as old as time, and war. If we go kind of back to the Roman and other annals of warfare, you would do a blockade. You'd sack the granaries, destroy cities. I mean, so some of it is as old as warfare has been with us. But of course, we've now got all these new instruments. We've worried a lot about cyber war, and the information war has been going on for a long time. And Russia's really had the leading edge in this. I mean, a lot of the things that we see in pushback on US policy in Ukraine have been seeded by Russian propaganda. And that also takes us back to the 1920s, where we started from, because the Bolsheviks immediately embarked on a massive propaganda campaign at home and abroad after they entrenched themselves in the wake of the Russian Revolution. And we've been dealing with their efforts to even export their form of revolution and their propaganda since the 1920s. There was an effort by Lenin and others to basically foment revolt elsewhere. There was, briefly a revolt in Germany. Many people might remember, back in that same sort of time period in the 1920s and other places as well. And we've always been in reaction to that. So information war, propaganda, influence operations have been with us a long time, but they've obviously stepped up because of the ease of transmission for influence and opinion and ideas through social media. And we've been engaged in many respects in that kind of information warfare, certainly since the Russians annexed Crimea in 2014, but even further back. Now, the cyber aspect of this, a lot of people have wondered, why have we not seen such massive cyber attacks? And we have seen cyber attacks, of course. And we've seen the fact that Ukraine is the second most attacked country after the United States in the cyber field. And, we're seeing all kinds of, new variants of this. I mean, I should have also mentioned that we're now in a whole realm of drone warfare, which this is, in many respects, the first drone war, and also a war that's being carried out on social media that you, I, and everyone here can get onto YouTube or Instagram and TikTok and see how, different parts of the battlefield are progressing. It was something that would have been heard of 100 years ago. We had to wait for dispatches from the field to come back, or World War II, where film reels were sent around to local cinemas because nobody had much of an idea what was happening beyond delayed information in the papers. Now we're seeing that all the time. But going back to the cyber front, the Ukrainians have been engaged in a kind of a counter-offensive on the cyber front since 2014. I mean, I guess that this is the area that we've often, again, as I said, been surprised that there hasn't been more cyber attacks that we've known about, but just that the Ukrainians have become more adept at dealing with those. And of course, there's still a considerable risk. We worry about the resiliency of our critical infrastructure. There've been attacks that we've been monitoring on energy grids. We've worried about sabotage, as there's domestic actors or external actors. There are lots of things that we have to factor in here, and we have to understand, Bob, just as I think you were suggesting there, that we're also the home front in this larger war, because Russia has declared war on us, whether we've declared war on them or not. Putin has made this very clear, that he sees his invasion of Ukraine and the conflict with Ukraine going on in the context of a larger conflict that he is waging against the West, the decadent West, in the culture wars and everything else that he's been pointing at, over the last year plus.
You talked a bit about the destruction in the Ukraine, and I just wanted to mention that every day I'm horrified by learning about new deaths, buildings destroyed, homes destroyed, families destroyed. A good friend of mine has made a documentary about what's going on in the Ukraine. I recommend it to all of you watching and participating in this program. It's called Freedom on Fire, and the director of the documentary is Evgeny Afanetsky, who is, as we are, most of us are good Los Angelinos. It really not only describes the terrible destruction to buildings and to infrastructure, but it talks a lot about what's happening to individual families and people and how they're destroyed, and the harm that's doing to the physical well-being of the people on site. I recommend that you watch it. He had 4 filming crews on the ground beginning in March of last year, running through September. So the name of it is Freedom on Fire, and it's certainly very well worth spending the 2 hours that it takes. And it's a very well done documentary. Elon Musk's Twitter is a Shakespearean psychodrama set in Silicon Valley. Elon Musk rules Twitter at his whim, extending the chaos of court battles and risking the future of his company. What message is Elon Musk sending to Putin?
Well, look, there are many people sending messages to Putin, within our kind of rather discordant, rhetorical ecosystem at all times. What Putin always sees is, United States that's all over the place. But what he also looks at very carefully is where can he get the maximum advantage? And Putin invariably, targets really prominent people, particularly business people who have interests in Russia itself. And Starlink, of course, we've heard a lot about how important that has been to Ukraine, but to have a global reach, ultimately Starlink needs to have basically receivers across needs to have some kind of land-based reception across most of the globe. And of course, Russia is the country with the largest landmass. Same with China having a major landmass as well. So Starlink and Elon Musk can't be truly global if Russia, China, Iran, and other countries, North Korea, much smaller, of course. But if large swathes of the world are off limits, and we often see Elon Musk opining and giving his views on all range of subjects, most notably lately on the whole issue of Russia-Ukraine, and pushing, basically a resolution on effectively Russia's terms, because of course he's also got a vested longer term interest. Then we were worried about the safety of satellites, the future of SpaceX. Russia is a major space power. There's all kinds of things that you can kind of see playing out there. So Elon Musk is exactly the kind of person that someone like Putin and the people around him would want to target as an asset, and an asset meaning someone that they could persuade, to jump into an issue on their terms. We've also actually seen on Twitter Elon Musk directly engaging with Dmitry Medvedev, the former president of Russia, who remains a very close associate of Putin, still on the Security Council at large, and potentially still even at some point a contender for the presidency. So there's a lot of back and forth like that. And that's the kind of thing that Putin's always looking for, people who can be very influential in the US system, because he understands that the US system is pretty porous. It can sometimes be rather amorphous. That's one of our strengths, but it's also a great weakness. So how can you get influence into the system? Where are there open doors? Where can you get your opinion out? We saw in 2016 with the creation of the Internet Research Agency, also the acronym IRA, which has a completely different interpretation now with, the Irish Republican Army, the Inflation Reduction Act. I really wish people choose some different acronyms here. It gets very confusing. But the Internet Research Agency, based in St. Petersburg, set up by Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is infamous as being the catering chief for the Kremlin and now the head of the Wagner and other paramilitary groups, which is also sweeping people up to fight in the war in Ukraine. They spent a lot of time doing research into the segmentation of thinking in the United States and where they could push buttons. So again, the Kremlin spends a lot of time thinking about where are the vulnerable points, the weak spots, or the points of entry in the US system, and how can they try to shape the discourse. And if you were the Russians and thinking along their lines, of course you would want to do that through Twitter, even before Elon Musk was on it or owning it, or Facebook or any of the other major social media outlets, that you could basically get your points out there. They're trying to influence, they're trying to push things and nudge them in a certain direction. And ever since the Bolshevik era, they've had this idea of fellow travelers. People often use the word useful idiots. They're not necessarily looking for idiots, they're looking for fellow travelers. People who are thinking along the same lines as them, that they can nudge along and encourage them to basically give the messages that Russia wants to see transmitted, but to amplify them of their own accord. And that's the kind of thing that you sort of see happening with Elon Musk and many others. The people are doing it for their own purposes. They're not being manipulated necessarily by Russia. They think that they're actually often speaking independently, but they're definitely being pushed and nudged in a certain direction and fed information through, various different pathways.
A point of example of your comment about Russia targeting US businessmen, Evgeny, who I spoke of just a few minutes ago, did a film a decade ago on Ukraine, which the Russians disliked very much. So as he was premiering that film in Canada, at the film festival there. He ordered from his hotel room, room service, a dinner. It was served with poison, that he almost lost his life. He was taken immediately to a first-class hospital emergency room, which really saved his life. And it turned out to be a chemical that only is made in national laboratories. And it was very clear that it was a Russian orchestrated attempted murder. So those things happen.
Yeah, there's a lot of ruthlessness in the Russian system. We've seen the use of Novichok against Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia in Salisbury, and of course also against Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader, and we also suspect potentially against Vladimir Karamurza, who's also now in jail, who many of us here on the the Zoom know personally. And of course, the use of polonium. I mean, one of the classic examples against Alexander Litvinenko that turned him into a dirty bomb in the streets of London. It's all meant to scare people. If you can't persuade them, you have to intimidate them and instill fear and get them to, pull back on things you don't want them to do. And I mean, right now, Putin's in full-on intimidation and psychological operation instilling fear mode, because he wants the United States to draw back its support from Ukraine.
Fiona, tell us about the opinion you authored on January the 11th and what led up to your conclusion that a coup had been attempted.
Right, so we're talking about the aftermath of the election here, of course, in 2020. Again, I'm a historian who has been studying coups, revolutions, and other similar manifestations throughout history. So, I know one when I see one. But the other thing, of course, is that I worked within the previous administration in the National Security Council and got to see and hear President Trump on a regular basis. I already heard and I talk, about this in the book, but some of the ways in which he manipulated not just language, but talked openly about desire to stay in power and wanting to push back against the checks and balance. I mean, look, we've just recently heard him say publicly that he'd like to have seen parts of the Constitution suspended. President Trump was pretty open, though he would often say he was joking about it, but it didn't ring as a joke, about his desire to stay in power. And of course, there's a direct thread going from the first impeachment trial after the phone call that you referenced, in which President Trump was trying to extort President Zelensky of Ukraine to open up investigations into Joe Biden and Hunter Biden in the advance of the 2020 elections in return for a visit to the White House. And then, as we later learned, the release of pretty vital military aid. I mean, it was withholding that. I mean, when I left the White House, as I described in the impeachment trial, when I was asked to be a witness, I knew that a visit was being withheld, but I hadn't made the direct connection at that particular juncture with the military aid, which became very apparent as time went on. So we saw already an effort to extort a foreign leader with the event of changing the pathway of the 2020 election. And when you start to put all of these pieces together, and then you see the way that this all unfolded, again, the checklist of a coup, which I laid out in that Politico piece, you can very clearly see what was happening. Now, technically, it's a self-coup, because it's the kind of thing that was perpetrated back by Napoleon III in France back in the day, Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, and many others who have done their uttermost to stay in power. And look, we're seeing a whole roiling of the firmament in Peru right now, with a kind of a clash of an outgoing president trying to change things. We've been very worried about what would happen in Brazil with Bolsonaro. So, I mean, this is a very risky time that we have in world politics, where leaders don't want to accept the election results and want to overturn them in some way. And we see with Putin, for example, in 2020, he in effect created a kind of constitutional legal coup by getting members of the Russian Duma to put forward amendments to the constitution that will allow him to stay in power for yet another set of 2 6-year terms. And that was, of course, legally done, but it was certainly done with a view of extending his time in office, irrespective of how the elections might turn out. So we're kind of in an age right now where we see many world leaders trying to turn themselves into autocrats. And that's a kind of a similar period again to 100 years ago. We also saw the sort of rise of authoritarian states in that same time frame.
That brings back an old memory of the time I was in Igor Ivanov's office chatting with him over sandwiches and a bit of vodka, when at the very same moment that his boss was in front of the Duma demanding that he be allowed to disestablish the election of governors and make all those positions appointee positions of him. And of course, the Duma gave it to him that afternoon.
That's right. Yeah.
I think time is now to segue to Rachel, who's done wonderful work in preparing these series of meetings that we've conducted, and to allow my fellow council members to ask you questions. And so, Rachel, why don't you take it from here?
Thanks, Bob. Hi, Rachel.
Hi. Yes, thank you both so much for this fantastic conversation, and Dr. Hill for your time today to speak to us all. So we have a ton of great questions from our audience, and the first one is, we spend a lot of time focused on Putin to explain Russian foreign policy, but who or what are the other major influences on Russian state behavior, and what happens when Putin inevitably passes on?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a great question. And of course, it's one that many people grapple with all the time. I mean, it can't really be the case, right, that so many things can be determined by one man. But this is really illustrating the fact that we fixate on Putin, a major flaw in the Russian political system. Because as Bob is referring back to his memory of the appointment of governors and the removal of direct elections, the Russian system over time, which was already arranged in what they call a vertical of power, has become a narrow vertical of power. Instead of being kind of a pyramid with more people basically having devolved authority beyond the top, it's become narrower and narrower. And Vladimir Putin has become the decisive person in the system and also the wild card. The wild card in the sense that we spend a lot of time speculating, is he sick? Is he not sick? Even if he is not sick, given the fact that he's now turned 70, and you look at the actuary, tables for Russian men, how much longer can he go on? If he's really got these 2 more terms in office of 6 years each, another 12 years after 2024, he'd be well into his 80s. What kind of health will he be in? Will he still have control of all of his faculties? And as the question is suggesting, what about all of the other people who see the system bottled up, who would like to have an opportunity to become president? Alexei Navalny is sitting in jail in a penal colony, was poisoned with Novichok previously because he actually had the temerity to say, well, actually, I'd like to be president and I'd like to see a shift here. And Alexei Navalny is an incredibly brave person. He's so much younger than Putin, and he also represents a different segment of society. And so in many respects, Russia has become extraordinarily fragile. And yes, there are lots of influences there. Political groupings matter a great deal. We're seeing people around the security services and the military now complaining an awful lot about the way that the war has been conducted. We have members of the Russian business community, the oligarchs and others who have, some degrees of influence. But ultimately, everything comes down to Putin and his decisions. And Putin is the person who made the decision to invade Ukraine. Now, he pretty much made it solo. I mean, there are other people who were in the decisions with him, but he's the guy who shaped this. And although he's brought other people along and there are a whole group of enablers around him, this is on him. And that, raises the question of if he leaves the scene by natural causes or, unnatural causes, who replaces him and what is the larger context? If we're in the midst of still a very brutal war, there is an opportunity for someone else who would come in to change the trajectory, because we've been calling it Putin's war and fixating on Putin. They would be given the space to decide for a way out of this. But given the fact that Putin has dominated so much, and so many people have been trying to emulate him. And you do have people now who are calling for more vicious prosecution of this war. You might end up, like we saw in the case of the shift from Fidel to Raul Castro, or from Hugo Chavez to Nicolas Maduro, somebody who kind of just keeps on the same path, because that would be the base of support. And they've kind of come in basically promising to complete what Putin didn't get the chance to finish. There is, however, also a kind of possibility that reformers might emerge out of this. And again, it depends on, where we are and how things are going. There are a lot of things that can shape what happens domestically from the outside, not just the inside. We can already see that some of the surrounding countries, Kazakhstan, for example, and others who are the former Soviet republics, are trying to move away from Russia. They're really worried about what's happening. They were previously very tightly aligned up until the invasion, and now trying to move away because they're very worried about the knock-on effects for them. We're seeing countries like China, pushing back on all the nuclear saber rattling, for example. And if it were the case that more countries start to get disillusioned with Putin and Russia, it's a question whether that will be the case. But if we saw more countries internationally and the loss of Russian prestige and the kind of sense that Putin was a problem on the global stage, then you might start to see something of a shift internally. And when I say that there's a possibility of someone emerging as a reformer, we've got to think back over Russian history. In the 1850s, when there was the Crimean War, Nicholas I basically died in the middle of that, and his successor, Alexander II, Alexander the Great as he's known, embarked on a period of reforms to kind of bring Russia back into the fold of European monarchies, because there was such a backlash to the Crimean War, and he emancipated the serfs. So that was a major step forward. World War One, of course, sparked off a revolution, but previously the defeat of Russia in the Russo-Japanese War sparked off the creation of the Russian Parliament and a whole host of reforms prior to that. And then if we think about in the more modern period, after Stalin died, we have Khrushchev, who tried reforms, and others there. And after, of course, the Soviet Union proved to be incapable of kind of keeping up with so many dramatic changes in the 1980s. We had Mikhail Gorbachev, who put the country on a very different path, and Boris Yeltsin doing something similar in the 1990s. So we can't always say it's going to go in one direction or the other. And I think that's what's so confounding for everyone, that there are so many contingencies, there are so many different pathways that this could take. And I think part of it, we have to start asking ourselves, what do we want? Where do we want things to be? Not just kind of waiting to see how things unfold in Russia or what happens with Vladimir Putin.
Thank you. We've had a few questions from audience members who would like your thoughts on today's news. They ask, what is your wisdom about the US sending Patriot missile defense systems to Ukraine? In today's headlines, the Russian Foreign Ministry responds that this is regarded as US provocation.
Well, look, what the United States has been trying to do is trying to find a way for helping Ukraine, fight back and literally shoot down all of this barrage of missiles that are coming in to Ukraine every single day. And as Bob's already kind of mentioned, there's plenty of films, and we can watch this on YouTube. This is the destruction, with the Iranian drones are one thing, but Russia's started to troll Ukraine recently by sending cruise missiles. Now remember, these don't have to be armed with a nuclear weapon. So whenever people think cruise missiles, for the layperson, they think, oh my God, cruise missiles. But, basically this is missiles with a longer range that can have a conventional payload, or they actually can be even empty, but just make destruction, just as something being, thrown in a certain trajectory. And they've started to use missiles that were sent back to Russia for decommissioning and dismantling in the 1990s, after Ukraine gave up the nuclear arsenal that it inherited from the Soviet Union. And in the wake of the Budapest Memorandum that the US and the UK signed together with Russia, that would guarantee Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. So the fact that some of these missiles are being used by the Russians and obviously weren't dismantled is just the ultimate troll of Ukraine, because Ukrainians are seeing these. So it's basically saying, here, just stick your 1994 Budapest Memorandum, and we know where to put it. I mean, it's just a classic, Russian action there. And so, I mean, the United States and other countries, this is, Stoltenberg from NATO, the General Secretary, has been talking about this as well, how to best position Ukraine for its air defense. We had debates before about closing off the airspace, about how to position them with the right kind of missiles for air defense. So this is all a debate about what are the right kind of missiles. And I've also noticed in some of the reports that people saying, well, maybe Patriots aren't actually the best, given the high basically demand for personnel and training, etc. There could be other systems, more of some of the things that we've been given here. So this will be a debate. But the Russian reaction is underscoring, kind of a major set of points here. Look, first of all, there's been a lot of equipment going into Russia, and we've been trying to avoid a direct NATO confrontation with Russians, and so have they actually. But what the Russians don't want is the Ukrainians to really be able to defend themselves. And the Patriots are very symbolic, because the Patriots are also the main competitor to Russian S-400s, which is their also major defense system that they've been trying to sell around the world. And we recently had what we think was an incident with the earlier version of this, the S-300s, when we had part of a missile fall in Poland with tragic effects, killing 2 Poles not too far away from Ukrainian border. The Russians have been in the business of trying to sell these air defense systems themselves globally, so there's a bit of an arms race component to that, but the Patriots is symbolically very important. The Russians pushed back when it looked like the Poles might, be in the business of getting Patriots or pushing for Patriots, for example, in other countries that Russia thinks of it's in its orbit of getting Patriots, because it's sort of seen to be, basically the ultimate protection and symbol of US defense. And frankly, Putin wants to see Russia wants to see, and Putin wants to see Ukraine defenseless. And so Patriots is seen as a major investment and a major symbol of Ukraine being able to defend itself and fighting back. And of course, it's made in America. And so that makes it look, even more, which is what Putin wants to portray it as, that this is a proxy war between the United States and Russia. Putin has been trying to deprive Ukraine of any kind of sense of agency or independence all the time, constantly talking about all of this in a US context. And so, Russia's already putting us on notice that they will change even further the way they talk about the war. This isn't about a war between Ukraine and Russia. Putin always wants it to look like it's a war between Russia and the United States, because he thinks that he will get more traction on the global stage that way, more sympathy, and be able to push back against Ukraine's diplomacy. He wants everyone to think that Ukraine is meaningless and that it's just a place to fight. And this is a showdown between Russia and the West on Ukrainian territory. So we have to be very careful about how we talk about this. We have to be very careful about how we think through, all of the implications of helping Ukraine defend itself. Because Putin is and the Russian Foreign Ministry, they're really trying here to spin the propaganda and the information part of the war very much to their advantage.
We've also had several questions come in about the likely outcome of the war and your thoughts on that. So the audience members ask, can Russia sustain a long-term war against Ukraine militarily, economically, and politically? If the war is prolonged, is a Russian collapse possible or likely?
Well, it depends on at what level. I mean, I think, what we're seeing now is a Russian attempt to sort of freeze the conflict, but kind of at low levels, which is, what we saw in Donbass when the Russians have kind of were genuinely fighting a proxy war with Ukraine there, with pro-Russian militias and actually often a lot of Russians themselves going in and fighting. And they kept this at kind of a lower level, boiling all the time. It wasn't exactly frozen. And there was, constant combat. And, we see that in many parts of the world where there's disputed territory. So Russia could sustain that kind of level of combat for a pretty long time. But, whether Russia can prevail in a much larger, longer war at the kind of intensity that it's on now. And look, this is why Russia's protesting against Patriots. The idea that the Ukrainians could effectively fight back and turn the tide on Russia, that would have a really negative and dramatic effect. Because Putin has prided himself on appearing infallible, always the guy who can turn things around and get a victory on his terms. That's what he's trying to do right now. He's trying to get us to capitulate and give up on supporting Ukraine so he can seize the territory. Just in the last 2 days, remember, he and his press spokesman and other people in the foreign ministry have said, no, Russia will not withdraw from Ukraine. Ukraine has to accept the prevailing realities, friendly negotiation. In other words, Ukraine has to negotiate away its territory. And that's kind of where Putin is going to have problems. if at any time he gives anything up, because he's tied himself to this war inextricably now. This is his war. This is his war for his version of history, his version of the Russian world, of an extension and expansion of Russian territory. He's trying to portray himself all the time as Peter the Great. He's probably mentioned Peter the Great more than anyone else, over the last several months and years. And Peter the Great, of course, was the Tsar, the emperor who conquered a lot of this territory initially. And Putin is determined to hold on to what he's got. And if he doesn't, that's when, a lot of these other pressures could really, start to rise up. And in fact, Nicholas I, when he died during the Crimean War, Russia was losing that war. They didn't lose Crimea as the peninsula itself, but they lost their broader efforts to expand their influence in the Black Sea. And so Putin really has been seen here to overextend it. He's gone, several bridges too far here. And so what he's trying to do is to find a level of the war that Russia can continue to prosecute and to take forward. So this is when people say, how is this going to end? It depends a lot on us. It depends on, how much we're prepared to support Ukraine, and not just us in the United States, but in Europe more broadly, our diplomacy, our strategic communications and explaining what this is and why it matters. And, basically how much we can constrain Putin's ability to keep on fighting the war, make it less likely that he can replenish the Russian military to keep on at this. I mean, we don't want to see Russia disappear from the stage. We want to, I think, over the longer term, find a way of engaging with Russia still. I mean, how can we not, given, the size of the country? But we have to figure out how to constrain and contain Putin's ability to basically demolish Ukraine, and to make sure that, Russia can't do this again with any of the other neighbors. And that is going to be, very much something we have to be focused on for the long term here. And sometimes I think it's kind of dangerous for us to keep saying, how long can this go on? How long can this end? Because a lot of this really depends on us. I mean, we have agency here as well, all collectively. We can continue to focus on this and to figure out how we deal with it and how we orient ourselves towards dealing with this reality, just like we've had to with so many other things.
That's actually a great segue into our last question, which is, if Russia is likely to stay in this for the long haul, what can the US do to minimize help to Russia by potentially neutral countries like India, Turkey, and China?
Yeah, no, those are three very tricky countries. And we also have to think about, how Russia's position is being received and thought about in Africa and Asia, Latin America, with countries like Brazil, major players, Mexico, for example, South Africa, thinking back in the African domain as well. There's a lot of critical countries here, what we might call swing countries, right? Those that are sitting on the fence. They're not really sure what they should be thinking about this. The Middle East is pretty critical here as well, because there's so much Russian money now being invested in the Emirates as oligarchs and business people moving their operations to the Middle East to try to avoid the sanctions and some avoiding draft and other kind of implications here. But those three countries that you're talking about were mentioned by the questioner are critical. India is probably in the most difficult position of all three, because we just saw in the last few days reports of clashes between India and China yet again on their disputed border in the Himalayas. And these clashes are now hand-to-hand combat, but a couple of years ago there was an actual exchange of fire in which a number of servicemen on both sides died. And India is really nervous about its relationship with China, and it always wanted to have Russia on board here. And that's obviously not going to happen, because Russia is growing increasingly dependent on China. And India does not want to basically have to make a choice. India would much prefer this was not happening. And we've heard Prime Minister Modi say many times, this is a time for peace, not war. There's been a lot of pushback on Russia nuclear saber rattling, because of course India is a nuclear power along with Pakistan and China, of course, and they're really worried about the implications of Putin deciding to use a battlefield nuke in Ukraine, about what that could mean for them and their disputes in Kashmir and the Himalayas and elsewhere. I mean, this is a kind of a nightmare scenario. So the Indians are trying to find a way of pushing back diplomatically, but at the same time also maintaining their relationships with Russia. We've seen India buying more Russian oil, for example. So it's a real conundrum for India, and we have to keep up the diplomacy there, but we also in the United States and the UK and elsewhere have difficulties because of this India-China bilateral relationship as well. And the Chinese have often told the United States to back out of the relationship with India, not just with other countries. Now China, I think, has a lot of disquiet about what's been happening, because China in the United Nations is always the cheerleader for independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, because Taiwan for them is linked to that. And our focus on Taiwan and obsession about, well, whether Taiwan is next has actually caused quite a lot of problems to China. We're seeing China is still battling with COVID. That's gone into a whole new phase there, having some economic downturn. We've had a lot of reports recently about potentially rising unemployment, as well as all the dissatisfaction we're seeing at the social level in China. I think they would like this war to go away as well. China was heavily investing in Ukraine before the war, interested in agribusiness and further agricultural development. The fact that Ukraine is off the agricultural market for potential years to come as a major player is really problematic in a country like China that has a lot of food security concerns. So, we're also seeing China hedging here. They don't want to give up on the special relationship they developed with Russia. That's also very useful, but they don't want to see this get into a broader and broader conflict, because it's very bad news for China too. And again, we're seeing China maneuvering around this and worrying about their relationship with the United States and how that's going to play out, and how all this affects larger global security issues. Now, Turkey, I think Turkey sees a real opportunity here. Erdogan has a very similar outlook to Putin, lives in history. He's always talking about the Ottoman Empire. Of course, they're shaped by lots of defeats by Russia in multiple wars. But Turkey sees an opportunity to play a bigger regional role, and even maybe a global role, offering good auspices for negotiations. We saw them have a breakthrough with the UN on grain and fertilizer and other commodity issues. And Erdogan has an election coming up in June, and he is all full throttle on getting himself re-elected. Just yesterday, I heard the news that he's given a prison sentence to the mayor of Istanbul, who was his main contender. Sounds very similar to what, with variations, of course, he hasn't poisoned him, of what Putin did with Alexei Navalny and trying to take him out of contention. And Erdogan is also then fixated on what kind of other concessions he can get out of Europe. Look at the way he's playing out Sweden and Finland and their NATO membership, particularly Sweden. Erdogan is just seeing an opportunity here to play everything to the hilt, to try to play it towards his advantage. Now, at the same time, remember, it's like the Putin issue. I'm talking about Erdogan here because Erdogan really dominates Turkish politics. And even though Turkish diplomats, may think differently, and there may be a different view about what's happening in Ukraine at the popular level, because remember, Crimea, the indigenous people of Crimea, Crimean Tatars, were Turks, and the Ottoman Empire actually ruled much of this same territory at different points before Russia annexed it, going back to the 16 and 1700s. So Turkey has a kind of proprietary interest in all of this, and especially in the Black Sea. Erdogan's whole mindset is basically laid out and circumscribed by those post-World War I treaties of Lausanne and Montreux. I mean, he's living in that same history of 100 years ago, which takes us right back to the beginning of where we started. And he's thinking of himself as, the new Ataturk, the new great leader of Turkey, for Turkey moving off into the 21st century and trying to overturn as well some of the impacts of the 20th century on Turkish politics. So Turkey, out of all of these, is probably the sort of the main contender for trying to turn opportunity out of the kind of crisis to its advantage, where India's, I think, in a really tough position, and China is also finding this not to its liking, even though one could say that China will benefit greatly from having a more dependent Russia on China, and also from the United States having to go and ask China so many times for assistance on the nuclear and other fronts.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hill, for being with us today and for sharing your expertise, and to our audience for such great questions. And I'll hand it back over to you, Mr. Abernethy.
Benefiting from that, I also want, on behalf of all my fellow members, to thank Rachel and Kim for all the good work they're doing with the council day in and day out. It's spectacular, and we all benefit from it, and we appreciate it. So God bless. Thank you, guys.
Bob and Dr. Hill, what a perfect way of concluding our 2022 programming schedules with such an excellent program, Dr. Hill and Bob. Thank you so much for everything that you've shared with us today. I agree. This is a spectacular informational program. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I just want to say thank you as well, and just a great shout out to the World Affairs Council. As Kim knows, I'm a big fan of World Affairs Councils writ large, and you're doing a wonderful job. And I'm just sorry I couldn't get to all of the questions. I was only just now glancing at the Q&A, and fantastic questions. This is obviously a really engaged and very thoughtful and well-informed audience, as one always finds at World Affairs Council. It's a great privilege and honour to be with you, and hopefully at some point I can come in person.
Yes, we want to get you out to Los Angeles next year when the weather's wonderful.
That's right, because it's pretty rainy and nasty here right now. I would love to get out there. But thank you so much to everyone, and
Thank you, Dr.
happy holidays.
Happy holidays to you as well. Bob, why don't you stay on the screen with me so we can thank all of our members and wish them a happy holiday. And please, if you haven't given us a donation, we will shamelessly ask to please make this a fabulous annual giving campaign for us this year. We do provide all of these live streams for free, but we do need to keep the lights on and keep these quality programmings coming. So just go to our website, make a donation. If you're not a member, join as a member. That would be great. And just a reminder, as Bob said, we have Michelle Flournoy coming up next year, and Marie Slaughter, and the new CEO of RAND, Jason Matheny. And back on January 3rd, we will have Dan Schnur back with his political report. So please, on behalf of Bob and myself, happy holidays to everybody, and we'll see you back in January. Thank you.